Good morning. I've been going around and around on the internet and Facebook, YouTube, with this debate on the property clause and the Constitution, the Enclave Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. And I thought I'd simplify a few things for people. I realize that people just have a hard time comprehending certain things. Now, they have an interpretation on the Enclave Clause that the Washington, D.C. and all the ports and docks and magazines, arsenals, only applied to Washington, D.C. That 10 square miles. They say it didn't apply to the whole country, all the United States. Well, in the Enclave Clause, it also states one of the powers of the federal government is to provide for the common defense of the country. The question I have for them, and I think it's the best way to put it, how in the world are you going to protect the entire country from Washington, D.C. with its port, its arsenal, its docks, magazines, whatever? That's insane. That interpretation is absolutely insane. I will say it was a microcosm of the larger, of the bigger. And grant you, there were just 13 states at that time, but they're very aware that it was going to grow, and you can get that from the Equal Footing Clause or the Property Clause, is their concern about states west of them being much larger than the existing states once the Constitution of the United States was ratified. How can people think that way? It's absolutely amazing to me. Okay? Now, and you have a precedence. You have a precedence ever since then of a couple hundred years. How does the federal government provide for these things, for the common defense? We call them bases or ports, like in San Diego or Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, or Hill Air Force Base here in Utah. In all cases, they were purchased by the consent of the legislature. You got 200 years of precedence there. That tells you how that was understood at the time. Okay, let's get real. I want to talk about prior appropriation. Everybody has heard of the San Francisco 49er football team. Okay, their mascot, if you look at him, is a miner. He's up there with the what they call his little mining pans. Okay, and in 1849, they discovered gold. Probably, I believe it was before 1849, but they discovered gold, lots of it, on the west coast of California. And there was a flood of miners and people that went there to get rich, to mine this gold. Okay, and when they would stake a claim, and this is real important. It's easy to research this stuff. It's not rocket science. They would stake, when they would find an area that had a sufficient amount of gold for them to be interested in it, they would stake a claim. And that claim was recorded in the United States Patent Office. Okay? And they had to stake it out, literally. They had to stake it out. And they had to give the longitude, latitude, or whatever they could to identify the exact location of that claim. Now, those claims, and I'm using them just as one example, there's several other examples. I'm using that as an example to show that they had a claim before California became a state. And after they became a state, those claims were recognized. That is known as a prior appropriation. Those claims were appropriated prior to becoming a state, and they are recognized. And that's why in your property clause, that the states, in this example, forever, okay, forever forsake all claims to those properties. In other words, once you become a state, they can't come back and say, hey, you know what? This is just one of the examples. You know what? We don't recognize your claim because it was made before this land became a state. All right? And also, you had to have your claim in before it became a state. Otherwise, it was considered unappropriated. How hard is that to understand? Okay? How hard is that to understand? Let's look at some more examples. Let's look at Indian treaties. Again, you know, those were appropriated before the territory becomes a state. About claims by foreign countries. Of course, everybody's heard about Russia purchasing, we purchased Alaska from Russia. We have heard of the Louisiana purchase. And there was, you know, then you got the Treaty of, what was it, Guadalupe, Hidalgo. That was a little bit different. There was actually a war over that. But we ended up giving the country of Mexico $15 million over that. And that was the settled claims that the American people had against Mexico. And that brings up an interesting point with the state of Texas. The state of Texas is the only that was never a republic, or excuse me, was never a territory. It came in as a republic. All right, it had already, I think it was 1836, had declared its independence from Mexico, and everybody's heard of the Battle of the Alamo. And then, but what happened was the people that were living there, who were the pioneers, went to war against Mexico for that land, declaring their independence. And that was because of the brutality of the Mexican government against those people. And they're fed up with it. And they're thieving and robbing and killing and raping and whatever. And they decided to declare their independence. And they wrote up their own constitution. They become a republic. And then when they were losing the battle to Mexico in this war, they petitioned the United States of America to come in and help them. But first they wouldn't do it. They had to come to some sort of agreement. And they did. They eventually came to an agreement, and then it became the Mexican-American War. And then we ended up having a treaty with Mexico, and it became known as the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty. And we ended up getting a whole lot more. State of Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, later became states out of that territory. All right? And then, so anyhow, if you had a claim, now if it was a country or a foreign country, it would buy you out. But if it was indigenous peoples, yeah, there would be a treaty there. If it was miners, if it was ranchers, then the way it worked out what called prior appropriation, and those were recognized after it became a state. Okay. And Congress has, I'll just read it to you, Clause 2, Property Clause. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. And nothing in this Constitution should also be construed as to prejudice any claims to the United States or any particular case. But they were to be disposed of, and that's in the Equal Footing Clause. Congress was to dispose of those lands. They were never meant to keep them. It just never was. They were to become states, okay, independent sovereign states. And in the disposal of those lands, and I just mentioned a few requirements, prior appropriations, but there was, you know, did you ever wonder how they drew the boundaries of these states? What went into the thinking? Obviously there was some thinking that went into the forming the boundaries of these United States, the perimeter, you might say. Yeah, there was a lot of consideration, and the number one consideration was natural resources, and the number one natural resource was water. Okay, and why would you have a state that's going to go fall flat on its face? All right. So that was one of the things that was really important, is could those natural resources actually sustain a population there? Because because the United States was forever sending people and creating incentives to send people west. You know, you could, hey, you could have 160 acres in a homestead, and that was more towards the Midwest and eastern United States. And then, but when it got to way out into the west, they had to increase it. They quadrupled it, as a matter of fact, because of very little water, and they needed to create incentive to get these lands settled. Congress wanted these lands settled. They didn't want any foreign governments coming in and invading and making claims. You know, as long as they were not settled by the pioneers and the Americans, there was always this threat. So they created these incentives to come out, go west, young man. You know, so then you had that was another one of your prior appropriations, was your homesteading. That's one I almost forgot. So now they form these boundaries. They have natural resources there, and so you had other requirements. You had to set up your state legislature. Let me back up. You had to have a certain amount of people. It was commonly recognized. They had to have, I believe, it was 80,000 people in that area before you could become a state. Then you had to set up your state legislature, your state constitution, your sheriffs. You know, certain lands had to be set apart for the federal government, for post offices, for forts. I mean, you can look all across the West. They had forts. You know, Fort Apache, one. I mean, they were there. Okay, and they had arsenals and magazines, and that was completely controlled by the federal government. Okay, so once you had these things in place, then Congress would dispose of those lands and it'd be as a sovereign state. Okay, and many times they're called nation states. So hopefully that explains some of this confusion. It's hard for me to imagine because it's just common sense. If you had all these pioneers coming out here and they were making all these claims because there was incentive to come out here, they're making all these claims. What good is it as soon as you know, become a state that, or down the road sometimes, the federal government comes in and just takes it from you? What good was it? Who would go along with that? Come out here and sacrifice and bust their butts, you know, fighting roving bands of Indians and the elements and the wildland. There used to be a lot of grizzly bears back here. That's why California is called the, what was it called? I forget. Anyhow, the Golden Bear State or something like that. You know, mountain lions were always invading their sheep and cattle, and because these predators were everywhere at that time. So there was a lot of sacrifice, a lot of chances taken when you come out here. You might get out into the west somewhere if you miscalculated, and you would be starved out. It happened a lot. It happened to a lot of pioneers. They just couldn't make it. So yeah, who would want that? Now let's go into preemptive rights. Okay, once a state became, or once a territory became a sovereign state, there's still all kinds of vast lands that were uninhabited, that had not been settled. Well, the state wanted to get those things settled as fast as, you know, they wanted production. You see, there's a completely different mindset back then compared to today. Today, nobody wants production. You know, they just see overpopulation. Well, that mindset did not exist in those days. Even when the state of Utah became a state, they still had to, and a lot of other, like Arizona too, in New Mexico, they still had to deal with roving bands of Indians, which did not have claims. Okay, they didn't set up claims, and they didn't have treaties for them. You see, there was a lot of people like the Basque Spanish in the state of Nevada. They didn't either. So they didn't get. There was no prior appropriation there. Now some of them, I believe, probably became ranchers at some time and did have preemptive rights. So let's get back into preemptive rights. A preemptive right is basically this: if you are first in line, you have first dibs or first claims on that land. There are just a few requirements. You had to stay and work the land, you had to defend it, and you had to be productive. Okay, you just couldn't stake a claim and leave it, you know. No, there were certain requirements as preemptive right. It's kind of like this. If you go wait in line to go watch one of these new movies that's coming out, like Star Trek is coming out here pretty soon, and it's going to be a big movie, and there'll be people getting in line hours ahead of time to watch that movie. Okay, if you're first in line, that's a preemptive right. Now if you get out of line, you lost that. But as long as you stay in line, that right is yours. That position, that place is yours. And if you wanted to, you could sell it. Somebody comes up and says, "Hey, I'll give you $100 for that spot, because I want to make sure I can see this movie." You can do that, all right. Or if one of your kids comes along and say, "Okay, son, here you can have this place." Now, when it came to land and property out west, all these vast lands, there's only those requirements, and it was the same with mining. The same with miners. You know, you had a preemptive right. You'd go out and prospect. I mean, you go all over the west, state of Nevada especially, man. There are all kinds of old mines where prospectors went in there. They took chances because there was incentive. And if they did find silver or gold or whatever, then they make that claim, and it became a preemptive right. Now it's recorded in that county, in that state. Okay? So hopefully that'll clear some things up. It's really kind of amazing to me that people have been so dumbed down that really instinctively you should understand these things, that it's human rights is that we're dealing with. We're dealing with what is known as common law. You have a right to your production. You have a right to, if you take chances or to do something and make it work, and it work for the benefit of everybody, you have rights to that. Just like copyrights, same thing, you know. You hear about that all the time, where somebody writes a song, and I mean, if you can show proof, even if you didn't get that song copyright, if you can show proof that that song was yours before, say, the Beatles took it or something like that, they owed you residuals from that. And it happens all the time. People go to court, and they win in court too. So anyhow, hopefully that'll help you out. Thank you very much.